Clara drove the last nail with shaking hands, though the board beneath it was already cracked and splintered. The hammer felt heavier with every strike, not because it weighed much, but because hunger and grief had settled deep into her bones. Around her, the land stretched wide, an indifferent and abandoned patch at the edge of town where broken fences, discarded crates, and warped planks were left to rot. This was where she had been pushed, quietly and without argument, once her husband was buried. The homestead had never been truly hers. It had belonged to his family long before she arrived, and the moment the soil closed over his grave, their sympathy dried up. They spoke gently at first, offering condolences and thin smiles, but their eyes already measured what she cost and what she was worth. A widow with no children and no claim, they said. A reminder of loss they preferred to forget. By the end of the week, Clara was gone, her few belongings wrapped in a faded shawl, her future reduced to what she could carry. Now she stood among ruins, building something that barely deserved the name shelter. Two crooked walls leaned against one another like exhausted companions. The roof was nothing more than overlapping boards weighed down with stones. Wind slipped easily through the gaps, biting her skin even during the day. Still, Clara worked. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the way her husband used to laugh when she scolded him for leaving tools everywhere. Remembering meant pain. She wiped her brow with the back of her sleeve and stepped back to examine her work. It wasn't much, but it might hold against the night if the weather stayed kind. Clara told herself that kindness still existed somewhere, even if she hadn't seen it lately. Survival required belief as much as effort. What she did not know was that she was not as alone as she believed. From the line of trees bordering the clearing, a man watched in silence. Elias had arrived that morning, riding into town with dust on his coat and old regrets on his back. He hadn't a plan to stay long, only long enough to settle matters left unfinished when his brother died. He had expected a grave, a few cold looks, maybe anger. He had not expected to find Clara here, bent over broken boards like a woman forgotten by the world. He recognized her instantly. She looked thinner, harder somehow, but it was her. The woman his brother had chosen, the one Elias had only met once before leaving town years ago. Guilt stirred uncomfortably in his chest. He had walked away then, leaving family and responsibility behind. Now, standing hidden in the trees, he was doing it again, watching instead of acting. Elias told himself she might not want to see him, that his presence would only complicate her life. He told himself many things, all of them excuses. Yet his eyes never left her hands as they worked tirelessly, never left the small, stubborn determination in her posture. Clara straightened and looked toward the horizon, sensing something she could not name. For a moment, she felt exposed, as if the land itself were watching her struggle. She shook off the feeling and turned back to her shelter. Whoever might be watching, help was not coming. It never did. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the clearing. Clara gathered the last of the loose boards and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Night would come soon, and with it the cold. Behind the trees, Elias took one step forward, then stopped. This was how it began. Not with words or promises, but with a woman building a life from ruins, and a man standing on the edge of it, unsure whether he deserved to step inside. Elias did not sleep that night. He sat his horse just beyond the trees, watching the faint glow of firelight flicker through the crooked gaps of Clara's shelter. The wind carried the sound of boards creaking and fabric snapping, and each noise tightened something in his chest. That fragile structure was all that stood between her and the cold, and he knew without needing to step closer how poorly it would hold if the weather turned. He told himself he was only staying to be sure she survived the night, that once morning came, he would ride on. This was her life now, not his. He had learned long ago that his presence often brought trouble rather than comfort. Clara, meanwhile, sat curled near the fire, knees drawn tight to her chest. Sleep came in pieces. Every time the wind pushed hard against the walls, she jolted awake, fingers tightening around her shawl. The ground beneath her was unforgiving, and the ache in her back reminded her she was no longer young enough to endure hardship without consequence. Still, she said nothing to the darkness, to the memory of her husband, or to the ache inside her heart. Complaining had never changed anything. At dawn, Elias watched her emerge, stiff and pale, yet already scanning the ground for usable scraps. She moved like someone accustomed to being overlooked, careful not to draw attention, careful not to hope. He recognized that posture too well. It was the same one he'd worn the day he left town years ago, turning his back on responsibility because it felt easier than staying and failing. As Clara worked, Elias remembered his brother's voice, steady, kind, always trying to hold the family together. He remembered the argument that had driven him away, words thrown like knives, pride standing in the way of reconciliation. He had meant to return. Life, however, had stretched forward without him, and now his brother was dead, and the woman he loved was building shelter from scraps. The town stirred awake behind him. Elias knew the looks Clara would receive if she ventured closer, pity mixed with judgment, kindness laced with suspicion. Widows were expected to disappear quietly or attach themselves quickly to another household. Independence made people uncomfortable, especially in a woman with nothing left to lose. Clara felt eyes on her again as the sun rose higher. She paused, hammer hovering mid-her, and glanced toward the trees. Nothing, just stillness and birdsong. She exhaled slowly, annoyed at herself for imagining things. Hunger made the mind unreliable, loneliness even more so. By midday, her hands were blistered, one palm split open and bleeding. She wrapped it in cloth torn from an old skirt and kept working. Stopping would mean sitting with pain, and pain had a way of leading her back to memories she wasn't ready to face, her husband's last breath, the silence afterward, the way his family avoided her eyes. Elias shifted uneasily. Every instinct told him to step forward, to offer help, to say his name. Yet fear rooted him in place. What if she hated him for leaving? What if she blamed him for not being there when his brother fell ill? He had no right to her forgiveness, and the thought of rejection felt heavier than the saddle beneath him. As the afternoon wore on, clouds gathered low and dark. Rain threatened. Elias knew her shelter wouldn't last through a storm. That knowledge pressed on him, stripping away his excuses one by one. Watching was no longer enough. Clara noticed the first drops just as she lifted another board. Rain spattered the dirt at her feet, slow at first, then faster. She looked up, jaw set, preparing herself for another night of cold and damp. Behind the trees, Elias finally took a step forward. This time he didn't stop. The distance between them was closing, whether either of them was ready or not. The rain came harder than Clara expected. Within minutes, the ground turned slick beneath her boots, mud clinging to the hem of her skirt. She scrambled to secure the loose boards along the roof, fingers numb as water seeped through the gaps. The shelter groaned under the sudden weight of the storm, each gust of wind threatening to tear it apart. A sharp crack split the air. One of the roof planks snapped loose and slid, sending a cascade of water pouring inside. Clara cried out not in fear, but frustration. She lunged to pull the board back into place, but her footing slipped. For a brief, terrifying moment, she felt herself falling, the world tilting beneath her. A hand caught her arm, strong, steady, unmistakably human. Clara gasped and twisted free, stumbling back until her shoulders hit one of the crooked walls. Her heart pounded as she looked up into the face of a man she had not expected to see again, Elias. Time seemed to still between them, rain drumming on wood and earth. He stood soaked through, coat darkened by water, his grip already loosened as though he feared touching her too long. His eyes searched her face, filled with something she couldn't immediately name: guilt, concern, regret, all tangled together. "What are you doing here?" Clara demanded. Her voice shook despite her effort to sound steady. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, not just against the cold, but against him. Elias stepped back, giving her space. "I came back to settle my brother's affairs," he said quietly. "I didn't know you were here." "That's convenient," she replied, bitterness slipping through before she could stop it. "No one ever knows where I am until I'm in the way." He flinched, the words landing exactly where she meant them to. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and for a moment he looked as worn and weathered as the shelter itself. "I saw you working," Elias said. "I thought maybe you didn't want to be seen." Clara let out a short, humorless laugh. "I didn't want to be abandoned." But that didn't stop anyone. Another plank shifted above them, the sound sharp with warning. Water poured through the opening, soaking the dirt floor. Clara cursed under her breath and turned back to the damage, refusing to let him see how close she was to breaking. Without asking, Elias moved forward. He braced the loose board with his shoulder, holding it in place against the wind. "You'll lose the whole roof if we don't secure it," he said. Her instinct was to tell him to leave. Pride rose fast and hot in her chest. She had survived this long on her own. She did not need his help now. And yet, the shelter shook again, and reality pressed in harder than pride ever could. "Fine," she snapped. "But don't think this changes anything." They worked in strained silence, rain soaking them both to the skin. Elias held boards steady while Clara hammered, their movements awkward but efficient. Each accidental brush of hand sent a jolt through her, half anger, half something far more dangerous. As the worst of the storm passed, the shelter stood barely, but it stood. Clara leaned against a wall, breath heavy, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. Elias stepped back, wiping rain from his face. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said. "I just couldn't keep watching." Clara met his gaze, her eyes sharp but tired. "Watching is easy, she said softly. "Staying is harder." The words hung between them, heavier than the rain clouds above. Elias nodded once, as if accepting a challenge he had long avoided. This was no reunion filled with relief or warmth. It was rough, uneasy, and full of unspoken pain. But the line between them had been crossed, and neither of them could pretend any more. The storm had forced them together. What came next would be a choice. The morning after the storm arrived pale and quiet, as if the land itself were catching its breath. Mist clung low to the ground, softening the jagged edges of the clearing. Clara stepped outside the shelter and surveyed the damage with a practiced eye. The roof still sagged in places, and one wall leaned more than before, but it had held. That small victory felt heavier than any loss she had known. Elias stood a few steps away, rolling his shoulders as if to ease the stiffness from sleeping outdoors. He had not asked to stay the night. He had simply remained, sitting near the shelter until darkness fell, then settling under a tree with his coat pulled tight. Clara had noticed, though she pretended not to. A part of her resented his quiet loyalty almost as much as she resented his absence all those years ago. Without discussion, they began to work. Elias fetched stronger boards from an old collapsed fence farther down the slope, testing each one before carrying it back. Clara sorted through nails, straightening bent ones against a stone, saving everything that could still serve a purpose. They moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing a narrow road, aware of every step, every breath. The rhythm of labor eased the sharpness between them. Hammer strikes echoed steady and sure. Wood scraped against wood. Silence settled, not uncomfortable, but weighted, full of things neither of them knew how to say. As they worked, Clara found her thoughts drifting despite her efforts. Her husband had always believed in fixing things rather than replacing them. "Nothing's useless if it's willing to hold," he used to say, pressing weathered boards back into service. The memory caught her off guard, tightening her throat. She drove another nail harder than necessary, forcing the feeling down. Elias noticed. He recognized the tension in her shoulders, the way grief surfaced in small, sharp movements. He felt it too, a quiet ache that never truly left. Every hammer blow reminded him of his brother's hands, strong, steady, patient. Hands that would never build anything again. At midday, they paused. Elias handed Clara a piece of bread from his pack without comment. She hesitated, pride flaring, then accepted it. Hunger won quickly. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the shelter, staring out at the open land. He used to do things like this, Clara said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Fix broken places. Said it made him feel useful. Elias nodded, eyes on the horizon. He hated waste, he replied. People included. The words settled between them, honest and aching. For the first time, Clara felt the weight of Elias's loss, not as an abstract grief, but as something real and personal. He hadn't just lost a brother. He had lost the chance to make things right. They worked again through the afternoon, more naturally now. Elias showed her a way to brace the weak wall using angled supports. Clara adjusted the roof slant so rain would run off instead of pooling. Their shelter began to look less like a pile of refuse and more like something intentional. As the sun dipped lower, the work slowed. The structure stood straighter, stronger. Not perfect, but dependable. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt and stepped back. It'll hold better now, she said. Elias nodded. You did most of it, she shook her head. Not today. They shared a glance, brief, cautious, but different from before. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding forged not by words, but by shared effort and shared pain. Grief still lived there, heavy and unresolved. But it no longer stood alone. Between broken boards and careful hands, something else had begun to take shape, quiet, fragile, and real. The shelter was stronger. So were they. By the third morning, Clara could feel the town's attention long before she saw anyone. It settled over the clearing like a chill, subtle but unmistakable. The road that curved past the edge of the land carried more traffic than usual slow-moving wagons, riders who lingered a moment too long before moving on. Eyes turned, voices lowered. Whispers traveled faster than the wind. Clara kept her head down and her hands busy. She swept dirt from the shelter's threshold, straightened the stack of remaining boards, and pretended not to notice the way a woman across the road paused mid-step to stare. Pride urged her to stand taller, to meet those looks head-on, but experience had taught her that attention rarely brought kindness. Better to be invisible. Elias, however, noticed everything. He had gone into town that morning to trade for supplies, returning with a small sack of nails and a coil of rope. The tension in the air was impossible to miss. Conversation stopped when he passed. Faces hardened, curiosity sharpening into judgment. By the time he reached the clearing, he understood exactly what was being said. The widow hadn't stayed in her place. The brother hadn't left when he should have. You should be careful, Clara said when he returned, her voice low. They'll talk. They always do. Elias set the supplies down with more force than necessary. Let them. It's not that simple, she replied. They don't lose anything by talking. I do. Her words struck deeper than she intended. Clara knew how fragile her standing was. Any hint of impropriety, any suggestion that she was dependent on a man again, could erase what little dignity she had managed to preserve. People were quick to decide what a woman like her deserved, and just as quick to act on it. Later that afternoon, the whispers took shape. A pair of men approached under the guise of friendliness, hats tipped, smiles thin. "Didn't expect to see you back, Elias," one of them said. "Especially here." Clara felt her stomach tighten. She stayed silent, standing just behind Elias, aware of how that alone might look. "I go where I please," Elias replied evenly. The other man's eyes flicked toward Clara. "Looks like she's found help fast enough." That was enough. Elias stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "She didn't find anything," I offered. "There's a difference. And whose business is it?" The man pressed. "Mine," Elias said without hesitation, "and hers. No one else's." The men exchanged glances, muttered something under their breath, and moved on. But the damage lingered, thick in the air. Clara turned away, anger and fear tangling inside her. "You shouldn't have said anything," she snapped. "Now they'll be worse," Elias faced her. "I wouldn't let them tear you down just because it is easier than minding their own lives." She laughed bitterly. "You can leave." "I can't." The truth of that settled heavily between them. Elias realized then that his presence was not neutral. It shielded her in one way while endangering her in another. The town would judge her more harshly than it ever judged him. That night, Clara barely slept. Every sound felt like accusation. She imagined doors closing, opportunities vanishing, faces turning colder. Survival wasn't just about shelter and food, it was about being tolerated. At dawn, Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the town wake. For the first time, he felt something shift inside him, not guilt or regret, but resolve. If staying meant standing against whispers, then he would stay. If protecting Clara meant becoming the subject of talk himself, so be it. The town could whisper all it wanted. He was done walking away. The night settled in slow and heavy, the kind that pressed close and left no room to hide from one's thoughts. Elias built the fire just beyond the shelter, arranging the stones carefully, deliberately. Clara watched from the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, uncertain whether she was guarding her warmth or her heart. The flames caught quickly, casting a soft glow over the clearing. Shadows stretched and shifted, bending the world into something quieter, more honest. The town's whispers felt distant here, unable to cross the ring of firelight. They ate in silence against simple food, shared without ceremony. The crackle of burning wood filled the space where words hesitated. "I should have been there," Elias said suddenly. Clara looked up, startled. His gaze remained fixed on the fire, jaw tight. "When my brother fell ill," he continued, voice low, "I was gone. Chasing work, chasing excuses. By the time I heard, it was already too late," Clara swallowed. She had never heard anyone in his family speak so plainly about that time. "He waited," she said softly, "not for help. For you." The words were not an accusation. They were a truth, and Elias flinched all the same. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid I'd come back and fail him. Afraid I wasn't the man he thought I was." Clara stared into the fire, watching a log collapse into glowing embers. "Fear doesn't disappear when you run," she said. "It just learns to follow quietly." He nodded. "I see that now." For a long moment, only the fire spoke. Then Clara drew a breath she felt all the way to her chest. "They took everything from me," she said. Not with cruelty, with smiles. With reasons that sounded reasonable enough, no one argued. By the time I realized I was alone, there was nothing left to hold on to. Elias turned to her then, truly looking. "You shouldn't have had to face that." "But I did," she replied. "And every day I wake up wondering if I'll simply disappear one day. If anyone would notice, The confession cracked something open between them. "You matter," Elias said quietly. "I see you." The words were simple, but they landed with surprising weight. Clara's eyes burned, and she looked away quickly, ashamed of the tears threatening to fall. "I don't want charity," she said. "I won't survive it." "This isn't charity," Elias replied. "It's choice. I'm choosing to stay." She studied his face, searching for doubt, obligation, or pity. She found none, only resolve. "Staying means consequences," she warned. "For both of us." "I know." The fire popped, sending sparks briefly into the air. Clara extended her hands toward the warmth, palms trembling. "I loved him," she said, "with everything I had." "I know," Elias answered. "That's why I'm here, not to replace him." "Never that." "But because what we lost shouldn't destroy what's left." Clara closed her eyes. For the first time since her husband's death, grief didn't feel like a solitary burden. It was shared now, acknowledged rather than ignored. When the fire burned low, neither of them moved to leave. The night wrapped around them, quiet and honest. Nothing was promised. Nothing was resolved. But in the firelight, truths had been spoken, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. Something fragile but real had taken root, glowing softly against the dark. Morning arrived with a sense of purpose Clara had not felt in a long time. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the land seemed if only slightly more forgiving. She stepped outside the shelter and studied it anew, not as a temporary refuge, but as something that might become more. Elias was already awake, splitting a length of wood with steady, practiced movements. He looked up as she approached, offering a small nod. No awkwardness lingered from the night before, only a quiet understanding that something had shifted. "We can do better than this," he said, gesturing to the shelter. "Not grand. Just solid." Clara hesitated. Hope was a dangerous thing. It asked for belief, and belief had failed her before. Still, she nodded. "If it's built to last." They set to work with renewed intent. Elias measured and reinforced the frame, replacing warped boards with sturdier ones he hauled in from town. Clara organized materials, repurposing everything she could salvage: old hinges, scraps of tin, lengths of rope. Waste had no place here. As the structure grew stronger, so did Clara's sense of ownership. This wasn't something given to her. It was something she was shaping with her own hands. By midday, the shelter no longer leaned. The roof angled cleanly, guiding rain away instead of inviting it in. Elias crafted a proper door from planks cut to fit, fitting it with a simple latch. When he stepped back, sweat streaking his brow, the pride in his expression surprised her. "It looks like a home," she said before she could stop herself. Elias smiled faintly. "It is." The words settled warmly in her chest. People from town passed by, some openly watching now. A few still whispered, but others paused longer, curiosity softening into something closer to respect. Hard work was a language everyone understood, even when they disagreed with the story behind it. That afternoon, a woman Clara barely knew approached with a basket of apples, setting it down without a word before walking away. Clara stared after her, stunned. Elias said nothing, allowing the moment to belong to Clara alone. Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh wood and earth. Sunlight filtered through a small window Elias had cut into the wall, illuminating the rough floor. It was modest, imperfect, but it was real. Clara ran her fingers along the wall, feeling the grain beneath her skin. "I never thought I'd have this again," she murmured. "You built it," Elias replied. "Don't forget that." As evening approached, Clara lit a small fire inside for the first time. Smoke curled upward and escaped cleanly through a simple vent Elias had fashioned. The warmth filled the space quickly, settling deep into her bones. She sat on the edge of the crude bed they'd made from straw and blankets, watching the flames dance. For the first time since her husband's death, the future didn't feel like an empty stretch of days to endure. It felt like something she might step into. Elias lingered at the doorway, uncertain. "I can stay nearby," he offered. "If you want," Clara met his gaze. "Stay," she said simply. He nodded, relief flickering across his face. As night fell, the cabin stood firm against the dark. It wasn't just a structure of wood and nails, it was proof. Proof that loss didn't have the final word. Proof that two broken paths could run alongside each other without erasing the past. A new home had risen, and with it, the quiet beginning of a new life. The morning Clara chose to visit the grave, the world felt unusually still. The sky was pale, clouded just enough to soften the sun, and the air carried the scent of damp earth. She dressed carefully, smoothing her worn skirt and tying her hair back as she used to when her husband was alive, not out of habit, but out of respect. Elias waited outside the cabin, hat in hand. He did not ask where she was going. He already knew. They walked together along the narrow path that led beyond town, past fields beginning to green with new growth. The cemetery lay quiet, tucked against a rise where the wind moved gently through the grass. Clara slowed as the grave came into view, her steps heavy despite the calm around her. She stopped a few feet away. For weeks she had avoided this place, afraid of what it would demand of her. Grief had kept her rooted in survival, in the immediate and the practical. But now that her days held something more than endurance, the weight of unfinished goodbyes pressed forward. Elias remained back, giving her space. He knelt near the grave, lowering his head, his shoulders tense. This was his reckoning too. Clara stepped closer and knelt, fingers brushing the cool stone. "I was angry," she said quietly, "not at you, at the world. At everyone who kept moving when you couldn't." Her voice did not break. It surprised her. "I tried to be strong," she continued. "But strength feels different when you're alone. It becomes something sharp. Something that cuts." She closed her eyes, remembering laughter, shared meals, ordinary days that once felt small and now felt immeasurable. "I'm not leaving you behind," she whispered. "I'm carrying you forward, just differently." Behind her, Elias spoke for the first time. "I should have come back sooner," he said, voice rough. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I loved you too." Clara turned, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she saw the full measure of his grief, not hidden behind guilt or restraint, but laid bare. It softened something inside her. "We all lost him," she said, "in different ways." They stood together then, side by side, the silence no longer heavy but shared. The past did not disappear. It settled, found its proper place. On the walk back, the land felt changed. Not brighter, not easier, but open. Possibility existed here now, woven quietly into the familiar. Back at the cabin, Clara paused at the threshold. She looked at the doorway, the fire pit, the small window catching the afternoon light. This place had been built from scraps and persistence, from shared labor and unspoken understanding. It held her past and her present without demanding she choose between them. That evening, Clara took out the last item she had kept hidden away, a small token of her marriage. She held it for a long moment, then placed it carefully in a wooden box, not discarded, not displayed. Honored, but at rest. Elias watched from across the room, saying nothing. "I'm ready," Clara said at last. Not to him, but to herself. Elias nodded, understanding. "So am I." As night fell, the cabin glowed warmly against the dark. The wind passed through the trees, carrying away the weight of what had been, leaving space for what might still come. The past no longer held them still. They had let it go together. The offer came quietly, the way life's most difficult choices often do. A rider from the neighboring territories stopped at the edge of the clearing one afternoon, dust-coated and tired. He spoke to Elias first, voice low but clear enough for Clara to hear. There was work opening up farther west, steady pay, long-term. The kind of opportunity Elias had chased for years, the kind that promised distance and escape. Clara felt the old fear stir immediately. She kept her hands busy, folding cloth, pretending not to listen. She told herself it didn't matter. Elias had his own life. She had learned, painfully, not to build her future on someone else's presence. That evening, the cabin felt smaller. Elias sat near the fire, silent longer than usual. Finally, he spoke. "I could go," he said. "It would be easy. Familiar." Clara nodded, eyes on the flames. "You always were good at leaving." He didn't argue. "I don't want to be that man anymore." She looked at him then, really looked. The lines in his face told a different story than the man who once rode away without looking back. This Elias carried his choices openly. "You don't owe me anything," she said carefully. "Staying shouldn't be a sacrifice." "It isn't," he replied. "That's what frightens me." He stood and paced the narrow room, then stopped in front of her. "I've spent my life believing freedom meant movement. But standing here, building something that doesn't disappear overnight, I finally understand what my brother tried to teach me." Clara's chest tightened. "And if you stay," she asked, "what happens to us?" Elias met her gaze. "Then I stay fully, no half promises. No watching from the trees." The honesty in his voice left no room for illusion. This was not a gesture born of guilt or duty. It was a choice. Clara rose slowly. "I won't be a replacement for what you lost," she said. "And I won't live in anyone's shadow." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said. "I don't want a past filled in. I want a future built, silent, settled, thick with possibility." Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the cabin walls they had raised together. Clara thought of the broken boards, the whispered judgments, the nights spent believing survival was the best she could hope for. She thought of mornings that now began with purpose. "I choose you," she said quietly. "But only if you're choosing me, not because you're afraid to leave." Elias stepped closer, careful, as if approaching something sacred. "I choose you," he said, "because staying is the bravest thing I've ever done." They did not rush the moment. No sudden declarations, no grand gestures. Just a shared breath, a shared understanding. Later, Elias told the rider he would not be coming. The man shrugged and rode on, carrying the opportunity away with him. Clara watched until the dust settled, half expecting regret to follow. It didn't. That night, they sat together on the cabin steps, shoulder to shoulder. The stars stretched wide above them, indifferent and eternal. For once, that vastness did not feel lonely. They had chosen each other not to erase what had been lost, but to honor it by living fully. And for the first time, the future felt like something they were walking toward together. Part 10. From Broken Boards to Strong Foundations, 600 Words. the change did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, settling into the days the way sunlight slowly fills a room. Clara woke early now, not out of fear or necessity, but anticipation. Mornings carried purpose instead of dread. She tended a small patch of ground beside the cabin, turning soil with care, planting what little she could spare. Ilias repaired fences for neighboring farms, earning honest coin, returning each evening with dust on his boots and steadiness in his step. The cabin changed too. Elias reinforced the foundation with stone, lifting the structure just enough to keep dampness from creeping in. Clara stitched curtains from salvaged fabric, softening the rough interior. Together, they built shelves, a proper table, a place for everything they needed and room for things they didn't yet have. Word spread, but the whispers shifted tone. People greeted Clara now, not warmly, not always but respectfully. She was no longer something pitied or discussed behind closed doors. She was visible, present, rooted. One afternoon, as they worked side by side mending the doorframe, Clara paused and rested her hand against the wood. "I used to think this was just a place to survive," she said. "Something temporary," Elias smiled faintly. "Turns out the strongest things start that way." She met his gaze, understanding what he meant. They had both arrived here broken in different ways, pieces salvaged, not whole, but willing. As autumn deepened, the cabin held firm against colder nights. Firelight warmed the walls. Laughter, soft at first, cautious, found its way back into the space. It startled Clara every time it escaped her, as if joy were something she had to relearn. One evening, Elias placed a simple ring on the table between them. No ceremony, no audience. "I'm not asking to replace anything you've lost," he said. "Only to build what comes next together, if you'll have me." Clara's throat tightened. She thought of the woman she had been hammering broken boards in the dirt, believing survival was the highest goal left to her. She placed her hand over his. "I already chose you," she said. "This just gives it a name." They did not rush the future. They let it grow the same way they had built everything else, with patience, honesty, and work. On the first snowfall, Clara stood outside and watched flakes gather on the roof that no longer sagged, no longer threatened collapse. Elias joined her, draping a coat over her shoulders without a word. "This place saved me," she said quietly. He shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just stayed long enough to see it." She leaned into him, the cold sharp but welcome. For the first time, the land did not feel indifferent. It felt like home. What began as a shelter made of broken boards had become something far stronger than wood and nails. It was trust, choice, commitment. And in that small cabin, built from loss and watching shadows, Clara and Elias proved that even the most fragile beginnings could carry the weight of a future. Winter arrived gently, as if testing whether the little cabin truly belonged on the land. Frost crept along the edges of the ground each morning, and the air carried a clean, sharp bite. Clara stood at the doorway one dawn, watching her breath fog in the cold, and realized something had changed deep within her. The fear that once greeted each new day was gone. In its place was a quiet certainty. She was no longer temporary. The cabin stood firm. What had begun as a desperate shelter of broken boards had been strengthened piece by piece, stone at the base, solid beams reinforcing the walls, a roof that no longer groaned at the first sign of wind. Elias had insisted on doing it right, not quickly. "Foundations matter," he'd said more than once. Clara had learned that lesson too, in ways far beyond wood and nails. Life settled into a steady rhythm. Elias worked nearby ranches and farms, respected now for his skill and reliability. He no longer chased distant horizons. Each evening, he returned to the cabin by choice, not obligation. Clara contributed as well, mending, trading, tending the small garden that stubbornly pushed life from the soil. Together, they were not merely surviving, they were building. The town noticed. People no longer whispered when they passed. Some nodded in greeting. Others stopped to talk. Clara felt her place in the world solidify, not as a widow to be pitied, not as a woman dependent on charity, but as someone who endured and remained. The land knew her now, and so did the people. One evening, as snow began to fall in earnest, Elias came inside and set something small on the table. A simple ring, plain and honest, catching the firelight. "I won't ask you to forget," he said quietly. "And I won't pretend we weren't shaped by what we lost." Clara touched the ring